The courtroom smelled like old wood and newer lies. Zara Oseimensa sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine so straight it looked architectural. She wore no jewelry, no makeup beyond the ghost of something tinted on her lips. Her attorney had advised her to look remorseful. She had listened carefully, nodded once, and then worn exactly what she wanted. A charcoal wrap dressed the color of smoke, the color of something that had already burned and was no longer afraid of fire. She did not look remorseful. She looked like a woman who had made peace with something the rest of the room had not yet understood. The gallery behind her was packed. Of course it was. This was the kind of case that turned ordinary people into amateur prosecutors, the kind that spawned 17 podcast episodes before the trial even began. The Penthouse incident, they called it online, as if naming it something cinematic made it easier to consume with breakfast. Zara had stopped reading the coverage after the third week, when a blogger with 400,000 followers described her as cold-eyed and calculating, based entirely on a photograph taken as she walked from a parking garage. In the photograph, Zara was not cold-eyed. She was squinting against the afternoon sun, but grief and sunlight look identical to people who have never felt either deeply enough. The prosecutor, a compact man named Aldrich Voss with the energy of someone perpetually auditioning for a television drama, was wrapping up his closing argument. He had been at it for 40 minutes. He had used the word malice 11 times. Zara's attorney, Priscilla Tambui, had been counting too. Zara could tell by the small tally marks on the corner of Priscilla's legal pad, each one drawn with the calm precision of a woman building a case inside her silence. The defendant, Aldrich Voss said, pausing the way television lawyers pause, letting the word hang over the gallery like smoke, stood on that balcony on the 23rd floor of the Haverson Tower and made a choice. A deliberate, premeditated, catastrophic choice. And a pregnant woman, fell. A sound moved through the gallery. Not quite a gasp, more like the collective intake of breath from people who already knew the story but wanted to feel it again. Zara did not react. She had trained herself out of reacting 3 months ago, sometime between the first bail hearing and the moment she understood that her face had become public property. What she did, instead, was remember. Not the balcony, not the sound, not the 17 floors of open air between the penthouse terrace and the street below, where a bone-white Rolls-Royce Phantom sat parked at an angle that suggested its owner had arrived in a hurry or left in one. She remembered earlier. She remembered the morning of when she had stood in her kitchen, the one she had designed herself, with the hand-painted Moroccan tile backsplash and the copper pots she never used but loved the look of, and read a text message on her husband's phone that rearranged every assumption she had ever made about her own life. She remembered that the coffee she had been holding went cold in her hand before she thought to put it down. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that frightened her even now, I always knew. I just never let myself know that I knew. Before we go further, have you ever had a moment where the truth was right in front of you, but some part of you chose not to see it? Drop it in the comments. You're not alone, and this story is about exactly that. The judge, a broad-shouldered woman named the Honorable Celestina Jurapark, adjusted her glasses and looked at the jury with the patience of someone who had heard every version of every human story and was still, somehow, not entirely cynical about any of them. She had kind eyes behind severe frames. Zara had noticed that on the first day and held on to it like a small private talisman. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Adjora Park said, you will now retire to deliberate. The jury filed out. 12 people who held her life in their collective hands, and not one of them knew the part of the story that mattered most. Not yet. Priscilla leaned close. She smelled like amber and strategic thinking. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Zara said. That's what people say when they're not fine. I know. Zara finally unfolded her hands, looked down at them. Her ring finger was bare, had been for 4 months. The absence of the ring had left no mark, no indentation, no ghost of pressure in the skin, as if the marriage itself had understood it was never meant to leave a permanent impression. Priscilla, do you believe me? Priscilla Tambui had been practicing criminal law for 19 years. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away for free. But something shifted in it now, something small and genuine, like a window opening an inch in a sealed room. I believe, she said carefully, that what happened on that balcony is not what anyone in this building thinks happened. It was not quite an answer, but from Priscilla Tambui, it was everything. The story begins, as most true stories do, not at the beginning but at the moment before the beginning, the last ordinary Tuesday, when Zara Osai-Mensah was still just a woman who loved her husband, trusted her life, and had not yet looked down at a phone screen and watched her entire world quietly rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. Her name was Zara. She was 34. She had a master's degree in architectural design that she had converted, through 12 years of relentless work, into a firm that now employed 22 people and had redesigned 3 hotels, a private arts museum, and the lobby of a building in Dubai that a magazine had called a meditation on negative space and ambition. She had been married for 6 years to a man named Tobias Wren. She had been in love with him for 8. And she had been quietly, unknowingly, catastrophically wrong about him for longer than either of those numbers. Part 2. The Architecture of a Lie. Tobias Wren was the kind of man who was beautiful in a way that made you feel slightly guilty for noticing. Not conventionally handsome, his nose had been broken twice, once in a rugby match and once in a circumstance he always deflected from with a laugh, but compelling in the way of things that have been weathered into their final shape. He had dark blonde hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck in humid weather, and eyes the color of shallow ocean water, clear and warm until you looked long enough to notice they didn't go very deep. He was a developer, commercial real estate primarily. He built things that other people filled with meaning. He had always been, Zara reflected later, somewhat like that himself. They had met at an industry event. Her firm had been commissioned to redesign the lobby of a hotel his company was acquiring. And he had approached her not with a line, but with a genuine question about the load-bearing implications of removing a particular wall. And she had been so surprised by the sincerity of it that she had answered for 20 minutes before realizing she was being charmed. By the time she realized it, she was already charmed. They were married on a Saturday in October, in a small ceremony in the garden of her parents' home in Accra during a trip back, with 40 people and too much jollof rice, and her mother crying in the particular way Ghanaian mothers cry at weddings, loudly, joyfully, with absolutely no attempt at restraint. It had been, without qualification, the best day of Zara's life. The 6 years that followed were good. Genuinely good, she still believed that. Not perfect. Tobias worked too much, traveled too much, had a habit of being physically present but mentally elsewhere that she had cataloged and filed under things we'll address eventually. But good. Warm. Built on what she believed was a foundation of mutual respect and the kind of quiet love that doesn't announce itself but is simply always there, like good bones in a well-designed room. She had been wrong about the foundation. She understood that now. What she had not understood, until the morning of the text message was precisely how wrong, and more specifically, who had helped him be wrong. The woman's name was Celestine Price. Not the judge, different Celestine. The world, Zara had discovered, contained more than one woman named Celestine who would rearrange her life. Celestine Price was 26. She worked in the acquisitions department of Tobias's company, had for 2 years. She was from a small town in the north of England, had moved to the city on a scholarship and stayed on ambition, and by every account available to Zara in the weeks following the discovery, she was intelligent, driven, well-liked by her colleagues, and had been sleeping with Tobias Wren for 14 months. 14 months. Zara had done the math with the particular cruelty she inflicted on herself in those first days. 14 months ago, she and Tobias had been on vacation in Portugal. She remembered the trip specifically because she had photographed a particular mosaic floor in Lisbon that inspired a design element she later used in the Dubai project. She had been happy in Portugal. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. And Tobias had come home from that trip and started sleeping with someone else. The text message that broke the world had not been explicit. It had not needed to be. It was a single line, sent at 6:47 in the morning from a number saved only as C, and it read, "Appointment confirmed for Thursday. They said 14 weeks is still fine for the scan. I need you there, Toby." Toby? Nobody called him Toby. He had told Zara he hated it early in their relationship as one of those small personal disclosures that feel like intimacy. She had honored it for 8 years. Apparently C had not been informed of this policy, or perhaps she had been given a different set of rules. Zara had put the phone down on the kitchen counter with a care that bordered on reverence. She had poured the cold coffee down the sink. She had stood at the window and watched a pigeon on the window ledge across the street conduct what appeared to be a very serious inspection of a piece of bread, and she had thought, with extraordinary calm, 14 weeks. She is 14 weeks pregnant. And then, because Zara Osimensa was an architect at her core, she began to draw up the plans for what came next. She did not confront Tobias immediately. This was the detail that Aldrich Voss, the prosecutor, had leaned on hardest in his opening statement. She waited. She planned. She chose her moment. He had used this as evidence of premeditation. What he had not understood, or had chosen not to present, was that Zara had waited not because she was plotting, but because she was grieving. Because there is a version of knowing something that precedes the ability to speak about it, a period of silent reckoning where the heart catches up to what the mind has already accepted, and during that period the only honest thing to do is nothing at all. She waited 4 days. In those 4 days, she redesigned a staircase for a boutique hotel in Edinburgh, attended a site visit in the financial district, called her mother and lied convincingly about being fine, and stood in her own shower for 20 minutes longer than necessary each morning, letting the water run until it went cold, as if temperature could reset something internal. On the 5th day, a Friday evening, she told Tobias she knew. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she had expected. Denial, perhaps, the frantic scramble of a caught man. Instead, Tobias had sat down at the kitchen table with the gravity of someone who had been anticipating this moment and had already rehearsed his lines. He had looked at her with those clear, shallow eyes and said, "I was going to tell you." "Were you?" "I just needed to. I needed to figure out what I was going to do first." "What you were going to do," Zara had repeated. "And what are you going to do, Tobias?" He had been quiet for a long time. The kitchen was very still. The copper pots she never used caught the light from the overhead fixture and held it. "I think," he said finally. "I need to be with her." When someone shows you who they truly are, do you believe them immediately, or does part of you hold on anyway? Tell us in the comments. This story is about to test that question in ways you won't see coming. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later. Zara moved into a serviced apartment while the legal division of assets was worked out. She took nothing from the house she had designed except her drafting table and a small oil painting her grandmother had given her, a Ghanaian coastal scene, all ochre and deep blue, the water meeting the land with the confidence of things that have been doing this for a very long time. She was not shattered. People expected her to be shattered. Her closest friend, a ferociously loyal woman named Deo Aramu who worked in international finance and had known Zara since university, arrived at the serviced apartment with red wine and righteous fury and the expression of someone prepared to be needed. Zara had opened the door, accepted the wine, and said, "I'm not broken, Deo. I'm rearranging." "You're allowed to be broken," Deo had said. "I know, I'll get there, but right now I'm rearranging." What she was rearranging, specifically, was the question of what she had missed. Not emotionally, she would circle that territory for months, but architecturally, structurally. The where and the how and the for how long. She needed to understand the blueprints of the lie before she could begin dismantling it cleanly. This investigation, such as it was how she had come to attend the party at Haverson Tower. What Zara had not yet shared with a single living person, not Deo, not Priscilla, not the police investigators who had questioned her for 9 hours across 2 days, was the name of the person who had invited her to that party. Not Tobias. Not Celestine Price. The invitation had come from a man named Rafferty Ackhafer. And Rafferty Ackhafer was, depending on which chapter of Zara's life you were reading, either the greatest love she had ever walked away from or the most dangerous mistake she had never quite made. Part 3. The man who arrived in a hurry. Rafferty Ackhafer had made his first million at 23 by solving a logistics problem that several much older and better-funded people had declared unsolvable. He had made his second through 10th millions in the 3 years following by refusing to be impressed by the first. By the time he was 32, by the time Zara met him, when they were both 26 and the world still felt like something that could be shaped by wanting it hard enough, he was running a private equity firm that operated with the quiet, confident efficiency of a machine that had been engineered rather than built. He was also, inconveniently, unforgettable. 6'2", with the kind of physical presence that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with stillness. Rafferty Ackhafer did not move through rooms. He occupied them. He had his father's Igbo cheekbones and his mother's Scottish directness, and the combination had produced a man who looked like art and thought like a surgeon. His eyes were very dark, nearly black, and when he looked at you, he gave you the full thing, not the polite half-attention that passed for engagement in professional settings, but the complete, undivided, slightly unnerving weight of his actual attention. Zara had been in love with him for 2 years before she understood that loving Rafferty Ackhafer required a tolerance for uncertainty that she could not, at 28, sustain. He had never been cruel. That was important to say. He had never been dismissive or unkind. He had simply been unavailable in some fundamental interior way, present and warm and generous, and yet somehow always slightly out of reach, like a room in a house you can see through the window but can never find the door to. She had spent 2 years looking for that door. Eventually, she had accepted that it might not exist, and she had left, and she had, in time, met Tobias Wren, who was warm and available and present in all the ways Rafferty had not been, and she had confused that availability for depth. She had not been entirely wrong. She had simply not known that some rooms are empty. Rafferty had heard about the divorce. She didn't know how Rafferty had always had an almost unsettling awareness of events in her orbit, not through surveillance, but through the kind of network that people with his resources and his particular quality of paying attention tend to accumulate. He had sent a message through Deo, not to her directly, which was either courtesy or cowardice or both, asking simply if she was all right. She had not responded. Then, 6 weeks into the divorce proceedings, an invitation arrived at her firm. A physical invitation, on heavy cream cardstock, for the launch event of a new arts initiative, a private foundation Rafferty had established to fund emerging African architects under 40. The event was to be held at his personal residence, the Penthouse at Haverson Tower. The irony of an architect receiving an invitation to a foundation for architects was not lost on her. Neither was the fact that the foundation was funding exactly the kind of work she had spent her career doing. She had stood in her office and turned the card over in her hands and thought about all the reasons not to go. She had gone anyway. Not for Rafferty. She had told herself this very firmly, in the taxi on the way. In the elevator on the way up, in the first 20 minutes at the party while she accepted a glass of something sparkling and spoke to a very enthusiastic young architect from Lagos about cantilevered structures. She was there for the work, for the connection, for the reminder that her life was larger than one man's betrayal. She had believed this right up until the moment Rafferty walked across the room toward her, and something in her chest did the thing she had spent 6 years training it not to do. He was wearing a dark suit with no tie, collar open. He looked exactly like himself, which was the most dangerous thing about him. Zara, he said. Just her name, nothing else. But the way he said it, careful, like something he had been holding gently, made her want to set down her glass and sit down somewhere quiet for a while. Rafferty, she said instead, with the composure of a woman who had designed buildings that withstood significant structural pressure. I'm glad you came. Your foundation work is impressive. That's why I came. He looked at her with those dark, full eyes. I know, he said. I'm still glad. She had been at the party for an hour and 40 minutes, and she saw Celestine Price. What would you do if you came face to face with the woman who destroyed your marriage, at a party you almost didn't attend? Drop your honest answer below. No judgment here. She recognized her from a photograph. She was not proud of the photograph, which she had found in a moment of self-destructive searching on Tobias's social media connections 3 weeks after the discovery. Celestine Price was tall, with copper-brown hair worn loose, and the particular glow that women in the second trimester sometimes carry, a luminance that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with biology. She was standing near the far window, a glass of water in her hand, and she was looking at Zara with an expression that was not triumphant, not guilty, not defiant. She looked frightened. Which was the first thing that didn't fit the story everyone would later tell. Zara set her glass down on a passing server's tray with the deliberate care of a woman choosing not to throw it. She moved across the room with the kind of controlled grace that comes not from calm, but from the iron containment of its opposite. People moved out of her way without quite knowing why. She stopped 2 feet from Celestine Price. You're here, Zara said, flat, declarative, not a question. Yes. Celestine's voice was English accented, softer than Zara had imagined. I didn't know you'd be. Tobias said you wouldn't. Tobias said. The words fell like stones. He told you I wouldn't be here. Something moved across Celestine's face. Something that looked, against all logic, like relief at being seen. Mrs. Wren, Zara, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find a way to tell you something for months, and there was never a. I don't need anything from you. I know you don't, but I need, she stopped, swallowed. Her hand moved to her abdomen in the unconscious gesture of pregnant women everywhere, protective and reflexive. I need you to know that I wasn't told the truth either. About you, about the marriage, about what he said the situation was. Zara was very still. What he said the situation was. He told me you were separated, that you'd been separated for over a year, that the marriage was that it was done, just not legally yet. She met Zara's eyes and did not look away. I know how that sounds. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I swear to you on this baby's life that I did not know he was lying, not until 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, something cold moved through Zara's chest. 4 weeks ago was when she had told Tobias she was filing. What happened 4 weeks ago? She asked. But before Celestine could answer, the doors from the interior of the penthouse opened, and Tobias Wren walked out onto the terrace. Part 4, What the Terrace Knew. He looked wrong in the space. That was Zara's first thought, an architect's instinct, the immediate reading of a person against an environment. The Haverson Tower penthouse terrace was all clean geometry and open sky, and Tobias in it looked like an error in the rendering. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were not the warm, shallow water she knew. They were wide and moving fast, scanning the terrace with the energy of someone doing damage assessment. When they landed on Zara and Celestine standing together, he went very still. Tobias, Zara said. Her voice was a level she had not known she possessed until that moment, below anger, below hurt, in the register of pure cold knowing. Would you like to tell me why you're here? I was invited. His chin came up. The old defensiveness, the one she had forgiven 100 times, rose in his posture. Same as anyone. You were invited to Rafferty Aucaffer's party. A beat, something shifted in his face. You didn't know whose party it was, Zara said slowly. Someone told you I'd be here and you came too. She stopped, turned to Celestine. Did you tell him you were coming tonight? Celestine was looking at Tobias, not with the expression of a woman looking at her lover, with the expression of a woman looking at someone she had recently and painfully recategorized. I mentioned I was attending a work event, she said carefully. A foundation event. I didn't give him the details. But he found you anyway. He always does, Celestine said, so quietly it was almost not audible. That's what I've been trying to tell you. What happened in the 40 minutes that followed was the part the podcasters loved best because it was the part they understood least. They had the security footage, partial, from inside the penthouse, showing movement but not audio, showing bodies in a doorway, a woman's arm outstretched, a figure near the balcony railing. They had interpreted this footage with the confidence of people who have never been in a room where every available truth is in the process of collapsing simultaneously. What they did not have was the conversation. Tobias had wanted, with the particular desperation of a man whose constructed reality is fracturing, to speak to Zara alone. Zara had declined. She had no interest, she said, in being alone with him anywhere, let alone 17 stories above a street. This was not fear. Tobias had never been physically threatening. It had never been that kind of marriage. It was simply that she was finished performing privacy for his benefit. Celestine had moved to leave, and Tobias had said sharply, "Stay." That word, The way he said it. Zara had watched Celestine stop moving, watched the slight drop of her shoulders, the small compression of her whole posture, and something had opened in Zara's understanding. A door she had not known existed, looking into a room she had not expected. "Tobias," she said, "how long has she been afraid of you?" "She's not," he made a sound of impatience. "This is ridiculous, your being." "How long?" Celestine was looking at the floor. She had wrapped both arms around herself now, no longer the protective gesture of pregnancy, but the smaller, inward gesture of a woman making herself compact. Defensible. It was a posture Zara recognized, not from her own experience, but from the training she had done years ago, a workshop on workplace dynamics that had covered, among other things, the body language of people living inside fear. "Celestine," Zara said, softer now, different register entirely. "Look at me." Celestine looked up. Her eyes were very bright. "Did he know you were pregnant before he told you the marriage was over?" Zara asked. The answer was on Celestine's face before she spoke a single word. "He told me the marriage ended because he found out about the pregnancy," Celestine whispered. "That it made him realize he had to be honest with you, had to leave, that you took it well, that you were both being adult about it." She swallowed. "That was 9 weeks ago. I believed him. I believed everything." 9 weeks ago. Zara had initiated divorce proceedings 8 weeks ago. The timing had a precise, terrible geometry. "He got ahead of it," Zara said. Not to Celestine, not to Tobias, to herself, to the architect in her who needed to see the structure. "He told you a story about me that would make everything make sense, so that when it fell apart you'd have already been prepared to." "Enough." Tobias's voice cut across the terrace. He had moved. He was closer now, and the terrace was not especially large, and the railing along its edge gleamed silver in the city light. "Enough of this. You're doing what you always do, Zara. You're building a case. You're constructing something. Everything is a project to you." "That's not." "You never just felt anything. You just analyzed it, designed it, filed it away." He was talking faster now, the words coming with the pressure of something long held. "Even now, your marriage is ending and you're standing there doing forensics." "My marriage ended when you decided it did," Zara said. "I'm just trying to understand the blueprints." "Stop," he stepped forward. Celestine stepped back. Zara did not step back. "Stop talking to her. She's not this doesn't involve her, this is between us." "She's carrying your child," Zara said. "She involves herself by existing." "I need you both to," he reached out. Not toward Zara, toward Celestine. Grabbed her wrist. Not violently, not with the force that breaks things, but with the grip of a man who was accustomed to being the person who decided when conversations ended. Celestine made a sound. Small, involuntary. The sound of someone who had made that sound before and knew there was no point in making it louder. And something in Zara Mensa, something that had been very carefully contained for weeks and months and possibly years, came undone. At what point does watching someone else being diminished become something you simply cannot stand by for? Tell us where your line is. The next part of this story turns on exactly that question. She did not push Celestine. She pulled her. This is the fact that the partial security footage could not show and the prosecutor had chosen not to emphasize, and the podcasters had gotten completely, irredeemably wrong. Zara had moved fast, decisive, with the spatial instinct of a woman who thought in 3 dimensions, not toward the railing but away from it. She had stepped between Tobias and Celestine, and she had pulled Celestine's wrist free of his grip and pulled her backward, toward the interior doors, toward safety, toward the inside. And Tobias, reaching for Celestine, had grabbed Zara's arm instead. And the momentum of 3 bodies in a small space near a railing in the dark had done what momentum in small spaces near railings in the dark sometimes does. Someone had gone over. And it had not been Celestine Price. Part 5, The Fall and the Phantom. The woman who went over the balcony railing of the Haverson Tower penthouse on a Thursday night in September was not a pregnant mistress. She was Zara Osei-Mensah. 17 floors. Not 23. The penthouse was on the 17th floor, and Haverson Tower's external geometry included 2 setback terraces, architectural elements that Zara herself had studied in graduate school as examples of how to create usable exterior space in high-density urban environments. The first setback was 8 floors below, a wide concrete ledge planted with ornamental grasses and boxwood. She hit it at a velocity that should have been unsurvivable, and was not, for reasons that the trauma surgeon would later call a combination of the planted soil absorbing impact, the angle of her body, and what he described, with evident discomfort at his own conclusion, as extraordinary luck. She had landed on the ornamental grasses and one arm, not her head, not her spine. She had broken her right arm in 3 places, 4 ribs, and her right collarbone. She had not died. The bone-white Rolls-Royce Phantom parked at an angle on the street below, belonging to a man who had arrived at Haverson Tower 20 minutes before any of this happened, who had been in the parking structure when his driver called to tell him the car had been moved to the street, who had been riding the elevator up to his own penthouse when the world outside it rearranged. That Rolls-Royce was Rafferty Acaffer's. He was 3 floors below the terrace when she fell past him. He made it to the setback terrace in 4 minutes. The paramedics took 12. He was holding her unbroken hand when she opened her eyes. The story the world received was assembled from fragments, as all stories told about women in crisis are assembled. From rumor, from incomplete footage, from Tobias Wren's statement to the police, which he gave in the hours after the incident and which described, with a precision that suggested preparation, a woman in a jealous rage who had physically attacked his pregnant partner on a terrace. Celestine Price had not given a statement that night. She had been treated for shock and released. She had gone home. She had not called Tobias. What she had done over the following 48 hours was think. And what Zara had done in the hospital, with a broken arm and cracked ribs and Rafferty Acaffer in the chair beside her bed still in his party clothes at 4 in the morning, was begin to understand the full shape of what had been done to her. He planned it, she said. Her voice was rough. The pain medication blurred the edges of things. Not the fall, he didn't plan the fall, but he planned he needed me and her in the same room. He needed something to happen that would shift the narrative. If she tells the police what she told me, he loses everything. The divorce settlement, the professional reputation, Zara, Rafferty's voice was very quiet. Stop designing it for a minute. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back at her with those dark, complete eyes, and for a moment the architecture of the situation fell away, and there was just the 2 of them in a hospital room at 4 in the morning, which was perhaps the most honest context they had ever shared. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the marriage, about Tobias, about all of it. I should have said that months ago." "You should have said a lot of things months ago," she said, but there was no venom in it. Too tired for venom. "I know." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Zara, 6 years ago when you left." "Don't. I need to. Rafferty, I have 3 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, and I am on what I suspect is a significant amount of morphine. This is not the moment. He almost smiled, not quite. When is the moment? When I've handled the man who just tried to destroy my life, using his pregnant girlfriend as a prop. Then we can have the 6-year conversation. He was quiet, then, fair. Yes, she said, and closed her eyes. Part 6, the DARKESD geometry. The charges came 11 days later. Attempted manslaughter. Assault causing grievous bodily harm. Tobias had retained a lawyer within hours of the incident. Not just any lawyer, but Aldrich Voss, who had made his reputation on high-profile cases with complicated facts, and who had a gift, his opponents said, for making complicated facts into simple stories that juries preferred. The simple story was this. Zara Mensa, in a fit of jealous rage upon discovering her husband's pregnant mistress at a party, had thrown the woman from a balcony. The story had traction because it had architecture. It had motive. It had precedent in the cultural imagination. It had the dark, satisfying shape of a thing people had always half-expected beautiful, wronged women to do. It fit the template of stories people had been telling about women since the beginning of storytelling, and that made it feel, to the people consuming it, like something they already knew. Zara had spent 3 weeks in the hospital. She had come out to a world that had largely decided what she had done and why. The discovery phase of the trial was where Priscilla Tambui began to build her architecture. She was methodical and brilliant and entirely unimpressed by the narrative Aldrich Voss had constructed. She had obtained the security footage, all of it, including the segments Voss's team had not included in their filing, and she had retained a forensic analyst named Dr. Soren Beck, a compact Norwegian man with round glasses who specialized in the reconstruction of physical events from video evidence, and who had testified in over 40 trials. Dr. Beck had spent 16 hours with the Haverson Tower footage and produced a report that was 42 pages long and contained, at its center, a spatial reconstruction of the events on the terrace that told a story entirely different from the one Tobias Wren had given police. The reconstruction showed 3 figures, one stationary Tobias, one moving backward, Celestine being pulled, one moving to intercept Zara. The subsequent motion was not a pushing motion toward the railing. It was, the report concluded with statistical confidence, consistent with a pulling motion away from the railing by the figure later identified as Zara, combined with lateral momentum from a reaching figure, Tobias, that resulted in uncontrolled movement. In other words, Zara had not pushed Celestine toward the railing. She had pulled her away from it. And in doing so, she had been pushed, not deliberately, not with intent over it herself. But the forensic report was not the deepest element of Priscilla's case. The deepest element was Celestine Price. Celestine had retained her own attorney, a quiet, methodical woman named Naomi Ape who had a reputation for patient. Thorough preparation, 11 days after the incident. She had provided a full statement, not to Tobias's team, not to the police initially, to her own lawyer who had held it while Celestine decided what to do with it. What Celestine's statement contained was not simply a correction of the events on the terrace. It was the underpinning of everything. We're at the darkest point of this story, but something is about to crack open. Before it does, do you think the truth always eventually comes out, or do you believe some lies hold forever? Tell us in the comments. Celestine Price had, in the 14 months of her relationship with Tobias Wren, been gradually, systematically maneuvered into a position of total dependence. She had not recognized it as it was happening. This was, Naomi Ape had told her gently, entirely consistent with the documented patterns of coercive control, which operates below the threshold of what people imagine when they imagine abuse, in the register of suggestion and isolation, and the slow replacement of a person's own perception with someone else's narrative about them. Tobias had told Celestine that her colleagues were jealous of her, that her friendships were draining her, that her instincts about her work were less reliable than she thought, but that he could see what others missed, that he understood her better than anyone. He had done this not cruelly but warmly, in the voice of someone looking out for her, over months, until Celestine's world had contracted to a size that Tobias could manage. The pregnancy had, paradoxically, been the thing that cracked the frame. Because a pregnancy requires appointments and doctors and midwives, and a whole apparatus of people whose job is to ask questions. And one of the questions a midwife asks at a 12-week appointment, in the routine screening that checks for things beyond the physical, is, "Do you feel safe at home?" Celestine had burst into tears. She had not been able to explain why, in that clinical room with the ultrasound gels still cool on her abdomen. But something in the question, the simple, direct, non-judgmental asking of it, had punctured something she had been pressurizing for months. The midwife had given her a leaflet, a number to call, a framework, finally, for understanding what had been happening to her. Celestine had called the number 6 days later, 2 days before the party at Haverson Tower. She had gone to the party because it was a work event, because she had decided she was going to stop contracting her life, because she had thought, naively, as she would tell it later, that public spaces were safe spaces, that Tobias would not follow her to a work event, that she could have 3 hours of simply being a person in a room without the architecture of his expectations around her. She had not known Zara would be there. But she had decided, in those 6 days since the midwife's appointment, that if she ever found herself face to face with Zara Osei-Mensah, she would tell her the truth. All of it. The discovery of Celestine's full statement by Priscilla Tambui's team, obtained legally through the disclosure process, changed the shape of the trial entirely. What had been a case about a jealous wife became a case about a man who had constructed an elaborate architecture of deception around 2 women simultaneously, using each as an unknowing structural element in a lie designed to benefit only himself. Tobias's team had not anticipated Celestine talking. This, Priscilla told Zara the evening after they received the disclosure, was the fundamental error of men who use women as instruments. They consistently underestimate the moment when instruments decide they are people. But the trial's darkest passage for Zara was not the legal machinery. It was personal and it was quiet, and it happened in the visiting room of the courthouse annex, when Tobias had requested a brief meeting through their respective attorneys, not to negotiate ostensibly, but to speak. She had gone, against Priscilla's advice, against Deo's considerable vocal opposition. She had gone because she was, at her core, a person who needed to understand structures, and she did not fully understand this one yet. Tobias had sat across a table from her and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not remorse, not guilt, something smaller and stranger, the expression of a man who is genuinely surprised by the consequences of his own choices. "I didn't plan for you to get hurt," he said. "You have to know that." "I know," she said. "That's almost worse." "Zara, you didn't plan it. You simply built a situation in which I getting hurt was an entirely foreseeable outcome, and you built it anyway because the planning wasn't about me." She kept her voice level. "It was never about me, was it? I was just context, background. the existing structure you were building around. He was quiet for a long time. I did love you, he said finally, at the beginning. I believe that, she said. I believe you loved me the way people love buildings they live in. Useful, comfortable, easy to stop noticing. She stood up. Goodbye, Tobias. She walked out. She did not look back. This, later, would be the moment she identified as the one where she stopped grieving and started rebuilding. Part 7. The Turning Point. Priscilla Tambwe was not a dramatic woman, but she had a gift for a certain kind of understated precision that, in a courtroom, functioned more devastatingly than drama. Her cross-examination of Tobias Wren lasted 3 hours. She did not raise her voice once. She simply built, with the patience of an architect, a three-dimensional structure from the evidence. The texts, the emails, the financial records showing Tobias had moved significant assets in the weeks following Zara's discovery of the affair. The testimony of 3 colleagues at his company who described, carefully and with evident discomfort, a pattern of behavior toward Celestine that was consistent with her statement. The phone records showing calls between Tobias and Aldrich Voss, beginning not in the hours after the incident, but 4 days before it. 4 days before. Priscilla let that land in silence. She was very good at silence. Mr. Wren, she said, you contacted the attorney who would represent you in the criminal prosecution of your wife 4 days before the incident that is the subject of that prosecution. Can you explain that? Tobias had an explanation. It was not a convincing one. His legal team had clearly anticipated the question and prepared an answer, but prepared answers, under the sustained, patient inquiry of a mind like Priscilla Tambwe's, have a way of developing hairline fractures that widen as the examination continues. By the time she finished with him, there were cracks in the structure wide enough to see daylight through. Rafferty Ackeffer testified on the 4th day. He wore a dark suit and he answered every question with the still, direct clarity that was his natural mode of communication. He described arriving at Haverson Tower, riding the elevator, the call from his driver, reaching the setback terrace, finding Zara. What was her condition when you reached her? Priscilla asked. She was conscious. She was in significant pain. She was lying in the ornamental planting on the setback terrace. He paused. She told me not to call anyone because she didn't want to cause a scene. A sound moved through the gallery. She had just fallen 17 floors, Priscilla said, and she was concerned about causing a scene. Yes, something almost imperceptible moved across Rafferty's face. She is, as anyone who knows her will confirm, the most controlled person I have ever met, in the best possible way and occasionally in the hardest possible way. Zara, sitting at the defense table, looked down at her folded hands. Mr. Ackeffer, Aldrich Voss said in cross, your Rolls-Royce was parked on the street outside Haverson Tower on the night in question. My driver had moved it from the parking structure, yes. And you are a former associate, shall we say, of the defendant. Zara Osai-Mensah and I were in a relationship for 2 years, yes. We ended that relationship 6 years ago. And you remained connected. We moved in overlapping professional circles. And it was you who invited her to the party. It was my foundation's event. She was on the invitation list, along with 200 other architects. You personally curated that list. A beat. I approved it, yes. So you specifically ensured that Zara Osai-Mensah, your former partner, who was at the time in the process of divorcing a man you presumably had some feelings about, would be in your penthouse on that particular night. Rafferty was quiet for exactly the right number of seconds. I invited a brilliant architect to a foundation event celebrating brilliant architects, he said. I would do the same again. Aldrich Voss sat down. He had not gotten what he wanted. He had instead gotten a description of Zara as a brilliant architect, stated flatly and without embellishment, in a room full of people who had spent 3 months describing her as a jealous wife. Priscilla did not smile, but Zara, watching, saw the small deliberate stillness that served as its equivalent. The night before closing arguments, Zara sat in Priscilla's office, and they went through everything one final time. The forensic reconstruction, Celestine's statement, which Celestine herself had agreed to read into testimony, a decision that had taken courage Zara recognized as the specific kind that only comes from having been afraid for a long time and deciding to stop. The phone records, the timeline. Is it enough? Zara asked. It's more than enough, Priscilla said. The question was never whether the evidence was sufficient. The question was whether the story was loud enough. What does that mean? Priscilla looked at her steadily. It means that the story they told about you, jealous wife, crime of passion, was a story people wanted to believe. Not because they're bad people, because it's a familiar shape. It fits in the brain easily. She folded her hands on the desk. Our job in that courtroom tomorrow is to make a different story equally loud, to give people a shape that's true even if it's less comfortable. The shape being a man who built a lie and let 2 women nearly destroy each other inside it. The shape being 2 women who chose, when it mattered, to tell the truth instead of the easier story. Zara was quiet for a while. Through the office window, the city was doing what cities do at night, burning with all its necessary light, indifferent and beautiful. Celestine, she said, how is she? Better than you might expect. She's relocated. She has support. I think she has a certain amount of relief, actually, which makes sense. Zara nodded. She had not met with Celestine since the hospital. Priscilla had managed the coordination of their respective legal situations with meticulous care to avoid anything that could be perceived as collusion. But she had sent a message, through Naomi Ape, that simply said, I believe you. I hope you're both okay. Celestine had sent back a single line, thank you for pulling me away from the railing. I should have said that first. I should have said that months ago. 2 women who were pitted against each other ended up telling the truth for each other instead. When have you ever found unexpected solidarity with someone who was supposed to be your enemy? We want to hear it. Deo came to the apartment that night with no wine this time. Just herself, and a container of jollof rice she had made, and the particular quality of presence that was her greatest gift, the ability to simply be in a room with someone without needing to fix them. They ate at the kitchen table. The small oil painting of the Ghanaian coast hung on the wall. Zara had brought it from storage, had hung it herself with a functioning right arm for the first time in months. The ochre and deep blue looked warm in the lamplight. Tomorrow, Deo said. Tomorrow, Zara agreed. And after tomorrow. Zara looked at the painting, the water meeting the land with the confidence of things that had been doing this for a very long time. I rebuild, she said. Obviously. Obviously, Deo said, and served her more rice. Part 8, the verdict and the architecture of truth. Priscilla Tambou's closing argument was 47 minutes long and contained exactly 0 theatrical pauses. It was, instead, a construction. She built it from the foundation up, laying each piece with the care of someone who understood that the difference between a structure that stands and one that collapses is in the quality of what you put down first. She began with the physical evidence, Dr. Soren Beck's 42-page forensic reconstruction, presented in plain language stripped of jargon, the spatial geometry of three people on a terrace reduced to its essential truth. One person had moved to protect, not to harm. One person had fallen as a consequence of protection, not attack. Then she built upward. The timeline. The phone records showing 4 days of preparation. The financial movement. The pattern of behavior documented by Celestine Price, corroborated by colleagues, consistent with every piece of independently obtained evidence. Then, at the top of the structure, she placed something that was not evidence in the legal sense, but was, she told the jury, the mortar that held everything together. She placed the character of Zara Osei-Mensah. "You have heard 2 stories about this woman," Priscilla said. "The prosecution has described a woman consumed by jealousy, driven by rage, capable of inflicting harm on a pregnant woman out of wounded pride." She paused, not theatrically but naturally, the way a person pauses when they are about to say something true. "The evidence has described a woman who, upon discovering that someone she did not know had been systematically deceived by the same person who had deceived her, moved to protect that someone at significant personal cost, who fell 17 floors rather than allow a pregnant woman to be pushed toward a railing." She looked at the jury. "I want you to ask yourselves, which of those descriptions is consistent with the evidence you have examined? And which is consistent with a story someone needed you to believe?" The courtroom was very quiet. "Zara Osei-Mensah did not throw anyone off a balcony," Priscilla said. "She pulled someone away from one, and she nearly died for it. The question before you is not whether she is guilty. The evidence has answered that question clearly. The question before you is whether you are prepared to hear a story about a woman that is more complicated and more true than the one that was told to you first." She sat down. Aldrich Voss's rebuttal lasted 12 minutes. He sounded, for the first time in the trial, like a man whose structure had been examined and found insufficient. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Zara sat in the courthouse annex with Priscilla and Deo and said very little. She drank 2 cups of courthouse coffee, which tasted like warm regret, and stared at her phone without reading anything on it, and occasionally looked at the door through which a clerk would eventually appear to tell them the jury was back. Deo held her hand. Not anxiously, Deo was not an anxious person, but with the steady, simple presence of someone who has decided that whatever happens, they will be here for it. Priscilla worked on her laptop with the focused calm of a person who has done everything in their power and is now simply waiting for the world to process it. At 3:14 in the afternoon, the clerk appeared. "Not guilty." On every count. The gallery reacted. The gallery always reacted in these moments as if the verdict had happened to them. The sound that moved through the room was collective and involuntary, the sound of a narrative resolving or failing to resolve, depending on which story you had believed. Zara sat very still. Not guilty. She had known, intellectually, that this was the most likely outcome, given the evidence, given the forensics, given Celestine's testimony. She had known it the way you know things that your head accepts before your body does. But the actual moment of it, the actual hearing of those 2 words in that particular room, at the end of those particular months, moved through her differently than knowing had. It moved through her body, through the broken places that had healed and the places that were still in the process, and it felt less like triumph than like release. Like something that had been held under enormous pressure, finally allowed to simply be. She turned to Priscilla and said, "Thank you." Priscilla looked at her with those quiet, kind eyes. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank Celestine Price. Thank Dr. Beck. Thank the 42 pages." She paused. "Thank yourself, actually. You held it together when falling apart would have been much easier." Deo was already crying. This was appropriate. Someone in the room should cry. Tobias Wren was arrested in the courthouse car park, 40 minutes after the verdict was read. The charges were not related to the fall. They were related to the financial restructuring, the asset movement Priscilla's team had uncovered during the discovery phase, which had been passed to the relevant authorities as a separate matter. Coercive control charges, filed by Celestine's attorney, were pending. Zara heard about this from Deo, who heard it from a contact at a law firm, which was how Deo heard most things. She processed it with the same quality of stillness she had brought to most of this year's revelations. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not the hot, clean feeling she imagined people expected her to feel. Something quieter. The acknowledgement that structures built on lies do, eventually, bear the weight of their own inadequacy. There was a moment, in the chaos of the post-verdict corridor, the reporters, the flashing phones, Priscilla navigating through them with the efficiency of a woman who had done this many times. When Zara looked up and saw Rafferty Ockhafer standing at the far end of the hall. He was not surrounded by people. He was simply standing there, still and watchful, hands in his pockets, wearing the same quality of dark suit he had worn to testify. He had not approached. He would not approach, she understood. He was giving her the space to choose, which was, she realized, the thing he had always done, and the thing she had misread as emotional unavailability for 2 years when she was 26, and did not yet understand the difference between a man who was absent and a man who was simply careful. She walked toward him. He watched her come with those dark, complete eyes. "It's over," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she said. "I'm rearranging." The corner of his mouth moved. Almost. "I remember you saying that word." "It's a good word." They stood in the corridor with the controlled chaos of the aftermath flowing around them, and it was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense. There was nothing soft or golden about a courthouse hallway at 4 in the afternoon, but it was honest, and honesty between two people who have survived something real has its own particular warmth. "I said I'd talk to you after," she said, "about 6 years ago." "You did." "I'm not ready to do that today." "I know. But I will be." He nodded, carefully, like someone receiving something they had long stopped expecting. "I'll be here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Don't say that like it's easy." "I know it isn't," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." Final one. Is there someone in your life you walked away from before either of you were ready, and you've always wondered what the honest conversation would have sounded like? Leave it in the comments. Sometimes saying it is the first step to having it. Part 9. What GETS rebuilt. 3 months after the verdict, Zara Osai stood in the shell of a building. It was a 19th-century warehouse in the east of the city, a space her firm had been commissioned to convert into a mixed-use cultural center, gallery on the ground floor, studios above, a rooftop garden that the clients wanted to feel like something between a forest and a conversation. The commission had come in during the trial. She had signed the contracts from a hospital bed with a borrowed pen and her left hand. Her team had begun the preliminary work without her. She was here now, walking the space for the first time, and what she felt was the thing she always felt in buildings before they became what they were intended to be, the possibility. The beautiful, enormous, specific possibility of what a space could hold. The brick walls were exposed, 3 stories of them, the old industrial bones of the place running through the new design like something essential and unrepeatable. There were skylights where the old loading bays had been. The structural engineer, a meticulous woman named Hannah Wolf, had confirmed last week that the original columns could be preserved. Not just preserved, but celebrated, worked into the design as the anchoring element around which everything else organized itself. Old bones, Zara thought, good bones. She pulled out her drafting pencil. She still used pencils, still sketched by hand before she put anything into software, still believed that the first language of design was physical, and made a note in the margin of her site plan. Something about the light. The way it moved across the east wall in the late afternoon, angled and golden, illuminating the irregularities of the brick, the variations in color and texture that machine-made surfaces never had. There was a story in that wall. Years and use and weather had written it, and the building's new life needed to not cover that story but work with it, around it, because of it. She spent 2 hours in the warehouse. She took 40 photographs. She filled 3 pages of her site plan with notes and sketches and questions for Hannah and questions for herself. She was happy. She recognized it with the particular attention of someone who has spent long enough unhappy to know the difference. It was not the loud happiness of big events and obvious victories. It was the quiet, sturdy happiness of a person doing the work they were made to do, in a space that was waiting to become itself. Celestine Price's daughter was born in January. She sent Zara a photograph through Naomi Ape. Just the photograph, no message. Because some things don't need words, and Celestine, Zara had come to understand, was a person of essential directness underneath everything that had been constructed around her. The baby was small and red-faced and entirely unconcerned with anything except the fact of being newly alive, which seemed to Zara to be exactly the right priority. She sent back a message that said, "She looks fierce. Good." Celestine sent back a single emoji, a small flame. Deo came to the warehouse site on a Saturday, ostensibly to see the space, but primarily, Zara suspected, to observe her, which was Deo's ongoing project and had been for the better part of 12 years. She walked the ground floor with her hands on her hips and her head tilted in the way she had when she was genuinely interested in something, which was a different tilt from when she was being politely interested, and Zara had long since learned to read the difference. "This is extraordinary," Deo said. "You're going to do something extraordinary here." "That's the intention." "It always is with you." Deo stopped at the base of one of the old iron columns, ran her hand along it. "How are you, Zara? Honestly." "Honestly. Honestly." Zara thought about it. She was standing in a shaft of afternoon light, in a building that was in the process of becoming something, and she had a pencil in her hand and 3 pages of good ideas and an arm that had fully healed and a collarbone that ached slightly when it rained, which was fine, which was evidence, which was the body's way of saying, "I remember, but I'm okay." "I'm good," she said. Genuinely, not fine, which means not fine, actually good. Deo looked at her with the appraising gaze of someone who had known her for long enough to be a reliable detector. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said, "you are." Rafferty had been patient. This was new, or not new precisely, but visible in a way it hadn't been at 26, when Zara had been looking for urgency and read patience as absence. He had given her 3 months. He had been in those 3 months, present in the ways she'd asked for and absent in the ways she'd needed. a message here, a simple check-in there. No pressure, no crowding, no construction of expectation that she would then feel obligated to either meet or disappoint. She had called him on a Sunday evening in December, 2 weeks before the warehouse visit. The 6-year conversation, she'd said when he answered. Now, he'd said. Now. They had talked for 3 hours. It was not a dramatic conversation. It did not have the architecture of a movie reconciliation, no grand declarations in rain-soaked streets, no single transformative revelation. It was a real conversation between two people who had been honest with each other about almost everything except the things that mattered over 6 years, and who were now choosing to be honest about those too. She had told him she left, because loving him felt like trying to furnish a room she wasn't sure she'd been invited to inhabit. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "I know. I kept the door locked because I was afraid of what it would cost if you saw everything inside and left anyway. And then you left anyway, and I realized the cost of locking it was the same as the cost of opening it. Except that if I'd opened it, we would have had the truth, and I wouldn't have spent 6 years knowing I gave you a reason to leave that wasn't the real one." Zara had sat with that for a while. "What was the real one?" she asked. "That I was terrified that someone as clear-eyed as you would eventually see through everything I'd built and find me less than what you deserved." She had not told him he was wrong. She had not told him he was right either. She had said, "That's a story you told yourself about me that wasn't true. I would have stayed for the real thing." "I know that now." "Do you know it enough to do it differently?" He had said, "I want to try. I'm not going to tell you I'm a different person. I'm the same person. But I think I finally understand what the room looks like from the outside. And I'd rather you see the inside of it than keep the door locked." It was not a promise. It was better than a promise. It was an honest assessment of where they were and what was possible, given who they both actually were. Zara had spent enough time in a marriage built on the wrong kind of promises to know the difference between a promise and a foundation. They had agreed to try. Not to leap, not to rush. To try in the way that people who have been honest with each other about the shape of their own limitations can try, carefully, with clear eyes, with the willingness to be uncomfortable in the service of something real. On the day the warehouse project officially broke ground, a cold February morning with weak winter light and the smell of turned earth and concrete, Rafferty arrived at the site at 9 o'clock with 2 coffees and no explanation. Zara saw him coming across the mud-churned ground and felt, in her chest, the thing she had felt for 26-year-old him, and then felt for years in the muted, archived way of things you have told yourself are over. Except that now it was not archived. It was present and unguarded, and she was 35, and had spent the past year understanding at some depth what it cost to live inside a beautiful lie, and so the feeling this time came with clarity instead of confusion. She took the coffee. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He looked at the building, the old warehouse, the exposed brick and the steel and the skylights and the possibility of it all. Then he looked at her. "Because you build extraordinary things," he said simply, "and I want to see them." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the building, and she smiled, not the careful, controlled smile she had worn in the courtroom, not the professional smile, not the smile of a woman managing her exposure, but the actual one, the one that her mother said looked like sunrise over Accra, the one she had been too afraid to show for too long to too many people. "Then stay," she said. And he did. Months later, when the cultural center opened, When the gallery walls held their first exhibition, and the studios were full of the specific productive noise of people making things, and the rooftop garden had been planted with indigenous species that would take years to reach their full growth, but were already doing what planted things do when they are given the right conditions. Someone would write an article about the architect. They would call her resilient, triumphant, inspiring. Zara would read the article once and set it aside with the equanimity of a woman who had learned that the stories people tell about you have very little to do with who you actually are, and that the only story worth architecting carefully is the one you live in. She would turn back to her drafting table. She would pick up her pencil. She would begin. Clapperboard epilogue, what the building holds. The final report of the forensic investigation into Tobias Wren's financial dealings was submitted to the relevant authorities in March. 14 pages of findings that resulted in charges that would occupy the courts for the better part of 2 years. Zara was not named in any of those proceedings except as the injured party, a designation she found accurate in the factual sense and insufficient in every other. Priscilla Tambui was named one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the country by a legal journal that spring. She sent Zara the article with a one-line message. None of this happens without a client who told the truth clearly and consistently. That is rarer than people think. Zara framed it. Not visibly, she was not performative about her victories. But it was on the wall of her office, beside the Ghanaian coastal painting, in the space she had designed for herself the way she designed all her best spaces. With room to breathe, with good bones, with light that moved and changed with the time of day, but was always reliably present. Deo, who visited the office approximately once a week under the guise of checking in on the project, but primarily to drink Zara's excellent coffee and occupy the good chair, noted the framed article on its first morning on the wall and said nothing except, "Good," which was, from Deo, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Celestine Price returned to work 6 months after her daughter's birth. She had taken a position at a different firm, not Tobias's company, which had undergone significant restructuring in the wake of the financial investigation, and had, by several accounts, arrived at her new role with the focused, quiet intensity of someone who had recently learned something essential about what she was capable of. Her attorney, Naomi Ape, had submitted the coercive control case to the Crown Prosecution Service. The outcome was pending. Zara and Celestine had met once for coffee. Naomi and Priscilla had both advised against it. Both women had done it anyway, because sometimes the advice of excellent attorneys is less important than the need of 2 people to simply sit across from each other and acknowledge what they had been through and who they were on the other side of it. They had talked for 2 hours. There had been no drama in it. No tears, no confrontation, no grand mutual forgiveness scene. Just 2 women at a table, talking honestly, finding, with some surprise and some recognition, that they liked each other. That they were, in certain specific and unexpected ways, very similar, both precise, both direct, both inclined to understand the world in terms of structure and foundation, and what holds and what doesn't. They had parted with an exchange of numbers and the open-ended, genuine intention of people who have decided they would like to know each other, given the choice. The choice was entirely theirs. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, Zara and Rafferty were sitting on the roof terrace of a restaurant 3 blocks from her firm when he said, without preface or ceremony, because he had learned that preface and ceremony were scaffolding, and what she needed was the actual structure. "I want to be clear about something." "All right," she said. "I'm not trying to repair what we had before. I know that's not what this is. What we had before was real, but it was also, I was keeping most of myself back, and you were trying to understand a room I'd furnished wrong, and it ended for legitimate reasons. He looked at her. What I want now is to build something new, with who we actually are, which I think is better. Zara considered him. The evening light was on his face, warm and generous, and he looked back at her without the reserve she used to press against in the dark, the interior distance she had read as unavailability. He was simply there, fully, the door open. I think so too, she said. I know I'm not easy. I'm an architect, she said. I don't build things because they're easy. I build them because they're worth it. He was quiet. Then, that might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me. It's not kind, she said. It's accurate. She picked up her glass. There's a difference. He smiled. The real one, the one she had seen only a handful of times in the years she'd known him. The one that changed the whole structure of his face, undid all the stillness, made him look briefly, genuinely young. She had always thought, privately, that it was the most honest thing about him. She smiled back. The city was loud below them, bright and indifferent and alive, doing what cities do, holding all its stories at once. The beautiful and the difficult and the true. The fallen and the rebuilt and the still becoming. The lights coming on one by one in windows across the skyline like questions finding their answers. Slow and inevitable and entirely worth the wait. Not every story about a woman who falls is a story about a woman who is pushed. Sometimes it is a story about a woman who reached for someone else first. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, in the way of things that are earned rather than given, it is also a story about what happens when she is caught.